Hi class, today we are looking at the chapter 13, Personality. It is an interesting chapter. It's interesting because it's many times the thing that draws people into psychology. Trying to figure out, well, who am I? Why do I do the things that I do? Or why do somebody else do the things that they do? It's a puzzle that we often pursue and want to understand. And so personality is the chapter that really delves into that. We're going to be discussing some of the introductions to it, some terminology, and then we're going to be looking at each of the types of theorists that are out there in this chapter, and then we discuss ways of measuring personality. So first, personality is defined in your text as the unique and relatively enduring set of behaviors, feelings, thoughts, and motives that characterize an individual. There's two key components. One is that it's unique, that each of us are unique from each other, and that it's also relatively enduring. It's consistent. There's two types of consistency that they talk about here. One is it's consistent over different situations, and then it's consistent over time. We continue to behave the same way. And so we're going to look at these different theories, and it will kind of elaborate on those two themes. There's also traits. Traits are, it's a disposition to behave consistently in a particular way. We're going to look at some of the theorists that they're called trait theorists that fall in that category. And they would say that traits are equally distributed, like our IQs. If you look at a normal bell curve, we're going to see different levels of introversion and extroversion being the other, on the polar ends of that bell curve. Nature versus nurture, what makes us? The evolution of personality traits, adaptive responses to problems of survival and reproduction shape our personalities by natural selection. And so maybe aggression that was really important, being physically aggressive 300 years ago, not so important now. Still want to be assertive, but aggression is probably going to end up sharing a room with like 6 other guys. So there's that evolution perspective. Then there's also genetics, and that we see that there are certain traits that we find when we've mapped the human genome that are markers here. For example, it's kind of interesting. There was a marker that was found, I believe it was in Norway or one of the Nordic companies, one of the Nordic countries. This marker that identified individuals that were more likely to stray in monogamous relationships. Kind of interesting. There's also what they call quantitative trait loci. These are these specific points of the DNA that we just mentioned. Another one can explain why some people are more risk takers than others. All right, let's see what we've got. We do know that when we take a look at research, when we look at identical twins, that nature explains 50% of our traits, and 50% of our traits are explained by nurture, so it's pretty equal. Let me go over, I'm going to shoot over to the different theorists now. It starts out with Sigmund Freud, interesting guy. He really was the person that got psychoanalysis into the main culture with his theories. He says that there were 3 layers of consciousness. There's the unconscious, one we're not aware of. There is a pre-conscious, which is like the tip of the tongue phenomena, and then there's conscious when we're aware of the events that are around us. He said the mind had 3 provinces: the id, ego, and superego. So the id is kind of like, it's also the pleasure principle. It's like all your desires let loose. And then we have superego, which is the opposite side, and that's all of the more moral rules that govern our lives. And so he would say that there's these 2 components that combat with each other all the time, all my desires and then all my moral rules, and then the ego kind of acts as a balance to it. It's what they call a reality principle. He did say that we develop defense mechanisms, and that's the one thing that has really stood the test of time as far as his theory is concerned. For example, denial. Denial is a defense mechanism, and it's a healthy thing initially. So if somebody told you, oh, comes in and says, John, you've got 2 months to live because you've contracted some rare form of Ebola virus, that's dangerous. Well, the way we cope with that is at first denial. It's like, you've got to do that test over again. And that's good. That helps us to manage the stressors associated with it. But denial left to its own devices is going to end up in your demise, especially if you don't find out, well, what do I need to do for this? Just deny, deny, deny. It's not going to be helpful. Let's go over. He said we go through 4 stages of development: the oral stage, anal stage, phallic stage, the famous Oedipus complex, latency, and genital stage. Those were components of his theory, and he would say as we go through each of those stages, the id, ego, and this id, superego, and ego interact with each other, and how we resolve those conflicts determines our personality later on in life. Then there's Alfred Adler. I liked Alfred Adler. He says, and so for Freud, everything was about sex and aggression. That drove our personality. Alfred Adler, he wasn't so into that. He was a protege or a contemporary of Sigmund Freud, but he believed that what drives us is a strive for superiority, not sex was the major drive that Freud said. And so, for an example, he would say, why is it that we see star athletes, most star athletes are not necessarily star in the area of academics. And the same thing, we don't see most star academics, academicians are not necessarily star athletes. Why is that? He would say that they are striving to compensate, striving for superiority to compensate a sense of inferiority in the other area. He did, it's really cool too, he came up with birth order, which is an interesting theory based off of statistics, and he's able to predict behavior based off of either firstborn, secondborn, thirdborn. It is pretty interesting. Kevin Lehman is a contemporary of his who's written a book called The Birth Order. He's hilarious. He's retired from ASU as a professor there. It's just an excellent book. We've got it at the library if you're interested in it. Also, if you're interested in doing your research paper in that area, it's very cool. Carl Jung had an adversarial relationship with Freud. Freud brought him on primarily because of anti-Semitism. He needed a Christian face for his theories. But Carl Jung digressed dramatically from what Freud was saying, and they would write horrible letters to each other in the newspaper about how bad each person was. Or awful. Well, he said the unconscious mind was the biggest factor, like Freud said, but he said there was also two components to it. Instead of the id, ego, and superego, he said there was a personal unconscious, which is kind of like Freud's unconscious perspective. And then he said there was a collective unconscious, and this was shared experiences, why we see these archetypes that are common in all cultures, like an evil person or a loving mom. These are what they call archetypes. He says, where did they come from? And so that's where he came up with his approach. These will all fall under the psychoanalytical umbrella. Then there was Karen Horney. She said that our personality stems from basic hostility or basic anxiety. It's kind of interesting. She was actually quite a mover and shaker at the time as far as the feminist movement. She was doing, I can't recall some of her milestones, but she had broken so many milestones as far as doing things out of characteristic. For example, she raised her daughter on her own. I know she was a professor at the university. I'm not sure she was the first one, but she's met all these milestones as a first female doing particular tasks. Interesting lady. She again said hostility was the key factor as far as our development is concerned. Then there's neuropsychoanalysis, and this kind of combines Freud's theories with neuroscience. Then there's humanistic positive psychology is the next big branch. So we go from psychoanalysis now to this next big branch. And what's nice about them is they're more optimistic about human nature. That humans are naturally interested in realizing their full potential. We've got Martin Seligman, who was a past president of the APA, kind of an interesting guy. He embraced positive psychology. Then we've got Maslow with his hierarchy of needs, self-actualization. Carl Rogers, he would say that people are naturally strive towards growth and fulfillment, need unconditional positive regard. Those are the key components of themselves. He would also talk about the need for distinguishing between our real self and our ideal self, and when there's this chasm there is what causes problems. So, for example, say I always want to be an NBA player, but I can't dribble or shoot. It's going to be a problem with me, and that can cause problems in our personality. Then there's social cognitive learning theories, Walter Mischel. People are not consistent across all situations. Trait theories, Gordon Allport. He was an interesting guy. What he did is he looked at, this is the 1930s, he looked at the dictionary, looking at terms defining personality in people. And what he found is that there was 10 or so central traits. So he kind of went that direction. And then there was McRae and Costa in 1980 who came up with a 5-factor model. And that's pretty much the thing that has really stood the test of time. So they said that personality is made up of 5 characteristics. And you can remember it from the acronym OCEAN. They were either open to experience or not open to experience. Conscientious, that means you apologize when you're late or not conscientious. Extroverted or introverted. Agreeable, that you are agreeable to new experiences, that type of things. Not new experiences, excuse me, that you just have that agreeable to things. You're agreeable to what's going on with the people that are around you, or you're more disagreeable. And then there's neuroticism, which sounds like a weird, but really it's just about anxiety. People that are really anxious or not anxious. They did have a spiritual component to it, but they've never really fully incorporated that into the 5-factor model. Then there's evolutionary biological theories. And again, that we are the way we are. Our personality is based off of the resolving our problems for survival and reproduction. Biological explanations is that our personality is in structures and systems, central nervous systems such as genetics, hormones, or neurotransmitters. So they're very much more nature than nurture, although nurture will play a role in developing who we are biologically. Eisens has got his 3 factors, psychoticism, extroversion, neuroticism. So he kind of like shortened the 5-factor model. He's got his hierarchical system that's really nice. Now we go to how we measure personality. And basically there's 4 methods. There's behavioral observations. This is most direct and objective method. Interviewing. And then projective tests like the Rorschach and the TAT that's in your text. Those are all cool tests. And then there is personality questionnaires like the MMPI, which is really quite famous in the California Personality Inventory. And so that's how we use to measure personality. I hope this is a good introduction to the chapter. Again, just highlighting some different points about it. And hope you enjoy the chapter. It's always fun for me to put it together. Thank you so much, guys.